So in our previous reading by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, she argues that a positivist desire to attain and disseminate the truth of peoples in their entirety is an extension of a colonial desire to manage and control land and bodies and preserve an image of what Western civilization stands for, dissolving indigenous peoples' ways of knowing by appropriating it into existing Western frameworks or discrediting it as invalid. So these colonial tensions are very much alive in early childhood education and research, and as educators, this requires us to acknowledge and pay attention to our positionalities and implication within these discourses, and where we fit as educators in responding to Canada's ongoing colonial history. Perhaps with technologies or methods and pedagogies that create more possible ethical spaces, not in the pursuit of moral purity, because I think in many ways this is a myth, but toward more livable and possible futures, tracing the histories of theories which inform our work, and in the midst of reconfiguring our ways of seeing, perhaps we might create spaces with children that don't subsume difference into the same previous structure of thought. So ways of knowing that rely on the naming and defining of objects is also known as representational thought. And this is a concept from the 17th century Enlightenment sciences, which proposed the definability and mastery of natural worlds through categorization and a separation of the looker over the looked at. So representational ways of knowing are based in semiotic dichotomies. The signifier, a name on an object, gives a certain value to what is being signified, the object, and in this case, the tree. So in this thought, knowers become reliant on the signifier or the name or representation of an object for truth. So with a stable image and definition of its value, it becomes static. We no longer require the object, the signified, to know. We can rely only on the signifier or the abstract representation of it. And this abstraction makes it much easier to generalize and classify. So representational knowledge has informed and continues to inform much Western thought, and though seemingly hidden, is visible in the structures which tend to guide early childhood education and developmental psychology. So things like ages and stages, licensing regulations, and curricular learning outcomes are some examples of the ways in which representation influences language and the movement of ideas and discourses in early childhood education. So these practices rely on representations and categorical thought in order to operate. And as we get deeper into thinking critically about this avenue of thought, I think something important to consider here is that in tracing or troubling representational thought, this doesn't mean denying its existence or abandoning it altogether, but in noticing commonsensical categories of thought that frame our practices, noticing seemingly hidden colonial grammars at play here, in this context of photography, we might think with care in how we use a camera and attune to what stories we choose to tell with a photo. So perhaps here we might be provoked to think things as otherwise and to be curious to the illusion of stability in a photo and consider possibilities for movement in other ways of knowing what it is that we're photographing. And perhaps might there be multiple ways of seeing what is traditionally signified. So in Sylvia's article this week, she writes that our methods of photographing, representing, or crafting worlds propose particular possibilities of how the world might be. So in remembering Canada's settler colonial histories and noticing how they continue to play out in our daily practices, perhaps we might begin to unsettle some of the ways in which we assume things have always been done in research, pedagogy, and in early childhood education. And in taking up this lens, perhaps we might consider ways of paying attention that highlight the banalities of everyday colonial violences and what kind of worlds we want to make possible with our photos. So to recognize the histories which shape an experience and create openings that allow for more complicated and contradictory ways of being here, to appreciate that there are many, that may not be only one story at play in a representation of something. And thinking back to the TED Talk that we watched about the danger of a single story at the beginning of this course, we can maybe consider how this concept of the single story might work its way into our representational practices via language and photography, and how we might try and attend to that and disrupt that single story. So staying with this tension of photography and paying attention to both the issues at play in this work and the possibilities that this method, this way of paying attention might offer us, it might help us to notice some seemingly oppressive banalities and use the act of seeing as both a project of doing and thinking, to use a photograph to propose something. And in your Pechakucha assignments, I hope that you use photography to gesture towards something worthy of critique and thought, and consider, how am I answerable to this representation as I take this photo? So in your Pechakucha, how might you represent a topic in a way that responds to the colonial narratives at play in capturing a photo, your positionalities within these narratives, and how you might represent something in a way that doesn't seek to define, name, or make stable, but rather that critically gestures toward a movement, impermanence, and critical thought at the symbolic value that's presented. So what does this photo gesture, propose, or enhance? And what might the symbol or metaphor make me wonder? What is curious, puzzling, or provocative here? So in our article this week, Sylvia writes, visual methods such as photography often focus on the meanings and intentions of an image. For instance, who took the photo, what it was of, why it was taken. This privileges the anthropocentric gaze, or the human gaze. And the semiotic purposes of photographs over dynamic, bodied, multisensuous enactments, and the material practices of photography. So throughout the project, in seeking to understand what might lie outside the frames of typical practices, she says she was less concerned with the representational potential, the meanings or semiotic purposes of the images, and rather she was interested in the visual worlds they created and what might be learned about the doings and enactments of photography. So when we think about photography, we are considering a way of seeing. We're taking a particular point of view and we're making a choice about what it is that we're looking at. So the photograph or the photographer invites us to see things in particular ways. So in your Pechakucha assignments, you'll be intentional about what it is that you are looking at and what it is that you are trying to represent. What are you trying to illuminate in your photograph? So thinking about a photograph not as a truth, but as a particular view, perspective, or moment that has been constructed, and how you are implicated in this construction, in movement. So in this way, photography will try to disrupt our usual perception of something, so that you're trying to make visible something critical, something puzzling. So this makes us think about how and what we see. So this week, there will be no weekly notes that are due, only discussions in your virtual collaboratories to give you some time to really focus on editing and creating a clear and concise Pechakucha presentation. So in your virtual collaboratory discussion, you'll be preparing for your Pechakucha assignment and considering how you might use photography as a tool to reconfigure meaning. So revisit the photos that you took last week of a symbol, material, or metaphor related to your topic and discuss the following questions with your group. So what histories does this photo make possible? What tensions might this photo speak to in relation to the topic? What is curious here for you and your group? And what does this photo gesture toward or provoke you to think? So really consider the symbolic value of the image and consider how it maybe is a manifestation or a visual sort of representation of discourses of developmental psychology, neoliberalism, or settler colonialism with specific relation to your chosen topic for your Pachacucha assignment. So also, if you have any questions about your Pachacucha assignment, feel free to email me as you have been. And if you feel like you need more support, we can always set up a Skype meeting and we can have a virtual face-to-face conversation that way. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great week.